Great. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second week at COP. I hope everyone had a chance to rest and recover yesterday. I know I did. Just to quickly introduce myself before we get going for today's session. My name is Martha. I work at the United Nations Global Compact. For those that don't know anything about the UN Global Compact, we are the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative founded within the United Nations. And I manage our work there on the blue economy, so with a strong focus on shipping and ports. So the session that we're about to have today is of particular interest to myself. And I have to say, I don't know if you've been following the discussions on shipping at COP27, but shipping is really high on the agenda. We even had the US President, Joe Biden, talk about the imperative of decarbonizing shipping. I think it's actually a first in COP history, so that's really exciting. And we also had the government of the US and the government of Norway launch the Green Shipping Challenge, which had a number of commitments from both state actors and non-state actors around decarbonizing the maritime sector. We had announcements around green corridors and investments in new fuels, so that's really exciting. And of course, ports are absolutely central to this. I mean, it will be impossible to decarbonize shipping without really taking a close look at ports. And by that, on the one hand, we're talking about lots of new infrastructure that will need to be built at ports for bunkering new zero emission fuels like green hydrogen, ammonia, methanol, these kind of things. And what we're really seeing are a number of ports now really stepping up, entering into these sort of really innovative collaborations around green corridors. We have the LA to Shanghai route. We had a number of other green corridor announcements at this COP as well. So they really are at the forefront of shipping's decarbonization. And it's not just about, the new infrastructure that will need to be built at ports to really service these new zero emission vessels. Actually, we just need to increase the efficiency at ports as they are. And I think something like 6% of fuel is burnt by ships waiting at ports. And some ships might spend half their time waiting at ports burning fuel. And of course, not only is this terrible for the environment in terms of rising emissions, but also has a severe impact on the communities around ports. Air pollution around ports is a huge topic as well. So obviously the topic of our discussion today is all around green ports, and I've just set the scene in terms of some of the mitigation, so reducing emission aspects we'll be talking about today. But I wouldn't be doing my job properly if I didn't raise some of the other vital issues like adaptation. Ports are obviously right on the forefront of climate change with rising sea levels. So when we talk about a green port, I'd also like to bring in adaptation into that mix. So how can we make more resilient port infrastructure? And I've already referenced some of the social dimensions, but of course, a green port is also a more socially inclusive port in the sense if it's reducing emissions, that is better for the community, good green jobs. So once again, green, yes, mitigation, but also we have a bit of a wider spectrum here. Now, I'm joined by 3 speakers who are all online, so I'm alone here in person today, but we'll still make it dynamic. So I don't know if the speakers are able to join on the screen, because it'd be great to see them when I introduce them. So on the one hand, I'm joined by the Chief Executive Officer of StormGeo, Soren Andersen, which is, and StormGeo is also part of the Alfa Laval group. So thank you for being with us here today. Good morning. I'm also joined by Oisein Jensen, apologies for any name mispronunciation, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer of Odfjell Group, which is one of the leading players in seaborne transportation. Hello, welcome, nice to see you again. And I'm also joined by Tiemen Meester, who is the Group Chief Operating Officer from the ports and terminals at DP World. So we've got all the players here from the maritime supply chain, so I'm sure we'll have a really useful discussion around that. So I'd first actually like to turn to you, Soren, so CEO of StormGeo. And the first question I'm going to ask all panelists, and I'd also like you to keep your answers relatively short as we are a bit under time constraint, just to quickly outline what is a green port to you and why is collaboration so important to achieve them?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think you actually gave us a bit of an answer there in your intro, right? What is a green port? But I think for me, it starts really with the efficiency of the port in a wider sense. And here I'm particularly looking at CO2 emissions, obviously. And as you very rightfully said, a ship spends up to 15% of the bunker consumption either waiting outside port or in the port. And 15% is a huge number, actually. If we can reduce that by a quarter or a third, we're taking out a meaningful amount of emissions from the shipping industry. So I think it's a very important point. So of course there's efficiency in the port, but there's also the waiting time outside port. And there you said, and I think that's a recognized number, that around 6% of bunker consumption is done just waiting to get into the port. So for me, a green port is a port that, in a sense, optimizes not only the time in where the ship is in the port, which I'm pretty sure ports are good at, but it's also to a wide extent eliminating that waste and that waiting time outside the port.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I'd now like to turn to Oisein to answer the same question. So what is a green port to you?
Well, I think it's important to start to clarify. Well, a port is not always a port is not always a port, because a port could be a terminal, it could be many terminals, and it could be different kinds of terminals as well. And each are managed very differently. And then there's also what is green. I think it's also too important to understand what is green. For some, green is something that is more environmentally friendly than something else, and someone see green as where you are not emitting any greenhouse gas emissions. So to me, I think it's the kind of the net zero way of thinking, that green is where you do not emit any greenhouse gas emissions. So for a port to be green, I think you have to be green in both scope 1, 2, and 3, and that will require also not only the direct emissions or the energy, but also the energy from or the emissions from the suppliers or from the total value chain. And that means that is a difficult task, because all the players, from suppliers to vendors to the ports, also have to be green in order to be zero in a scope 1 to 3 perspective. So that means that this will something that will require a lot of collaboration.
Thank you very much. So here we're talking more about a green port as a net zero port, and obviously, as already was touched upon, also an efficient port. I'd now like to ask you, Tiemen, Meester, the same question. So what is a green port to you, and why is collaboration important to achieve them?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and thanks for the participation in this. I don't want to kind of rehash what already has been said. But if you want to achieve carbon neutrality, or even better, zero carbon, the point, and also what my colleagues here are making, is you're going to be dependent on many, many stakeholders coming through. A little bit more specifically, ports are going to need access to renewable energy. That in itself is a huge topic. You need to electrify all kinds of operations. You need access to biofuels or other fuels. You need to focus on efficiencies, what also has been said. And then what is underestimated is the complexity of scope 3, because what we see in most of our ports is that scope 3 is as big as scope 1 and 2 combined. So the challenge is double up. And so your dependency on suppliers working with you is there as well. And then maybe my last point, if you take a terminal position, not the ports, then very strictly speaking, those terminals are not going to measure whether ships are outside, having their engines on or something else. And so, why is it important? There's a high complexity of many, many stakeholders that need to work together to make this all happen.
Thank you very much. So I think that first round sort of highlighted the complexity of stakeholders that are needed for a truly green port, both in terms of from renewable energy to some of the other players, particularly as scope 3 is such a relevant part of being a green port. So I'd now like to turn back to you, Oisein, to touch a little bit more on the efficiency question that was already raised in that first round. And I think it would be good for our audience and our listeners online to also hear a little bit about why it is difficult to improve efficiency in ports, and obviously that was already just touched upon a little bit as well. And maybe also from your perspective as a ship owner, what can you do to sort of help improve efficiency? Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. Well, to start, the ship comes from another port on the way and on the way to a new port. On the way to that new port, it has to go through many different kinds of weather and also different kinds of friction before it arrives to the port. Prior to the port, it has to do all the different planning, preparing for the port. And when it comes in for a parcel tanker, what we do in our ships, we have many different tanks with different kind of cargo. So that means that we have to go to different kind of terminals when you enter a port or a port area. So that means that it's not 100% sure when you arrive due to many different things, like you have to wait for the pilot, you have to wait for inspection, you have to wait for papers. So before you even arrived, there might be differences in time when you arrive. And there might be something on the way also. That means that you might not be there exactly on time. And when you're there, you have to do all these different kinds of operations. So again, coming from a parcel tanker, that means that you go in, you have to offload your cargo, then you have to clean the cargo, then you go out, maybe out to an anchorage. And in order for a chemical tanker or a tanker vessel to clean the vessels, you have to go outside. You can't do that in the port. So you go out and then you go in again. So for our operations for a kind of return in a port, for total operations in a port, for us it can take up to a month when you're coming in with a full parcel tanker into areas like Houston and before you leave again. So that takes a lot of time, and that many different players that take part in these operations. Everything from, as I mentioned, the pilot, the different kind of terminals, different kind of customers. You have to do bunkering operations. So all these different kinds of things, and many of them also have different incentives. So what we do is that we trying to plan this as much as we can. We of course have a very, very high incentive of making our port operations as efficient as possible. But if the port is not ready, the port is not ready. If the terminal is not ready, if there's a vessel there waiting, and that takes time, and we have to wait for it, there's not much we can do about that. So we have strong incentives to reduce the waiting time. But as you mentioned initially, also when we are on a waiting area or an anchorage area, we will still burn auxiliary engines, and that consumes fuel and emit emissions. So that's why we do whatever we can in order to make that as efficient as possible. But as I mentioned, there's many different players that needs to collaborate in order to make this very efficient.
Well, thank you. 1 month, that is a very long time. I might come back to you later just to hear about some other best practice examples of ports who you think are sort of doing a good job at supporting that process. But I'd now like to turn back to you, Soren. And we've heard from Oisein about some of the challenges here in terms of waiting times. And I guess I'd like to hear from you how digitization and digital tools can sort of support that process and support both ship owners and ports to make this process more efficient.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think we have the platforms, the basis in a sense to make it work. I mean, just as for StormGeo's perspective, we serve more than 13,000 ships every day with our digital services. We have almost 10,000 users of our office onshore operational tool, which gives transparency to both the ship and the office as to what's happening, what's the planning, is the ship performing as it should, et cetera, et cetera. So I really feel we're not lacking the channel or the platforms to make this work. I think the challenge is to get the right sort of information into those platforms and then present it to the users in the best way. And there's some things we can do in our R&D team. We're looking at predicting actually the port productivity, also port closures. And because we're very strong when it comes to the weather as part of what we do, we can, for example, predict whether ports will be open or not with some days in advance. So I think there's things we can do. And of course, then the ship can plan, right? If the port is going to be closed because of fog or swell or whatever, then the ship can slow down and not spend as much CO2. So I think the tools are there. Satellite imagery may help. AIS data, which is data coming from the ships about where they are and where they're going, that can be analyzed and we can learn from that. I think the real challenge is really getting the stakeholders to work together. And I think Oisein and Tiemen both pointed to some very important stakeholders. I think one stakeholder we're missing here in the forum is probably the cargo owner. because it takes all of us in a sense to operate together to make it work.
Thank
when
you.
I'm thinking about that, yeah, sure, go ahead.
No, sorry. I was just going to say, and please feel free to expand on that point, but I think this definitely, not just in shipping, I mean, this is something we've heard all this week at the COP27, right? I mean, we have the tools. It's the collaboration and the people aspect that's sort of the biggest barrier to making this effective change. But please do feel free to expand further on what you were just saying.
Yes, I guess, well, the stakeholders working together, I think we should start in a sense small, perhaps. Start with the smaller, easier steps, the low-hanging fruits that we can do together. I think there's economic incentives, but I'm worried that the amount of stakeholders together actually means that the economic incentives start to disappear a bit because we're so many that needs to share. So some sort of pressure from customers or from regulatory bodies is probably needed in order to get us going. That was my last point.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And I think, yesterday I was actually at a really interesting side event from the cargo owners for zero emission vessels. I don't know if you've heard of this initiative, but this is a group of leading cargo owners, including IKEA, but also Andersen and Hicke, who've sort of come together to send a demand signal for zero emission vessels by 2040. So these are the kind of demand signals that will be increasingly important. And I think things like efficiency at port should be included within that. It's not just about the zero emission vessels and the fuels, but also that wider kind of decarbonisation picture. So very much in agreement there. So I'd now like to turn to you, Tiemen. So let's hear a bit about the sort of port angle here. And please do feel free to reflect on some of Oisein's comments regarding waiting time at ports, and obviously hearing a little bit about things that DP World is sort of doing to mitigate that. So please, as I said, reflect on that question, but also good to hear from you what it will take from the ports, including port terminals, to commit time and resources to this challenge.
Okay, thanks for the question. A port, and it has been said, but I need to emphasize that it's an ecosystem of activity. There are many, many things going on in and around the port and the terminals that in the end of the day emit, CO2, to keep it simple. And the ship side is one element, the stevedoring is another element, and then what we call the land side is another element. I can tell you from our business, our single biggest challenge to resolutely and take the most CO2 out of our business is actually access to renewable energy. This is challenge number one, meaning most of the stevedoring operations and large part of the landside operations are already electrified or on the way to being electrified. But globally, in DP World, as an example, only 22% of that electricity is green today. In Europe, it's 50, so it's moving in the right direction. But our concern is you need to take a global perspective. We take sometimes a little bit of a Western Hemisphere perspective, but you need access to green energy everywhere, from your Australias to your Africas to parts of Latin America, et cetera, et cetera. And so access to renewable energy is really, for us, challenge number one, and it will make the biggest impact by any stretch of the imagination. Now, secondly, I was already hinting at, there's a lot of electrifications going on. We can see also when we're building new infrastructure, new modes of operation, the default mode is electric. But guess what? There's a new trend emerging, and that is not that there's a lack of technology. There's a lack of execution capability and a lack of what I call production capability. Today, if you want a turnkey area of your port electrified, you better wait in queue. You'll have to wait 18 months before it's your turn. So there's huge supply issues in actually getting the technologies to market in scale. And of course, this will be ramped up because in the end of the day, there will be commercial solutions and people will be making money of it. But we have some catching up to do. I'm not worried actually about the technology. It's an execution challenge. And then lastly, a little bit back to the water side. And maybe we can get some inspiration about the good examples. We have now, and actually in a weird way, we can thank the COVID years for that, where we've seen heavily congested terminals. We've seen shipping line as our key customers taking actions themselves. And because the schedule reliabilities were so low, and terminals were pushed for what I call recovery modes of operation rather than standard modes of operations, we've seen customers going to reinvent data exchange with us, meaning that if they're on the ocean, we get a twice weekly download of data on arrival on what's on the ship, in terms of cargo compositions. And it's continuously updated until they're literally outside and getting in. And these are also a few percentage points of efficiencies that you want to have. I think this is actually a positive trend, and we see it more and more coming because it's also driven by being on time in the end of the day. But for me, a green port, you have to work on all these three pieces in conjunction. But I'm actually optimistic. And like I said, our challenge is less technology than what we think it is. It's much more execution.
Thank you so much. I'd actually like to maybe keep on the renewable energy topic, if that's all right, and turn to you, Oisein, because obviously the shipping companies themselves face the exact same challenge as the ports. This is obviously a systemic challenge in terms of access to renewable energy to produce some of the new green fuels that we're talking about in shipping, like hydrogen, green hydrogen in particular, etc. So I just wonder from your perspective how you see that challenge in terms of access to renewable energy, and of course also how your company is kind of positioning itself and strategizing in terms of the green fuels of the future.
That was a big challenge to talk about that in a very short answer. But as you say, I think everyone is talking about the alternative fuel. What is the alternative fuel going to be? But in order for us to really be green, this has to be green in a well to tank perspective, and that means a well to wake perspective, and that means that the production of the fuel has to be done green, and that means that for most of those fuel, the e-fuels, the ammonia, that has to be produced in a green way. And as you say, that requires access to green energy. And what we see is that it will require enormous amount of energy in order to actually do that. And just an example, if you wanted to take the global shipping and transfer that to run on green ammonia tomorrow, that will require half of all the green energy that was ever produced and then I include nuclear as well, so non-fossil fuel in 2020, in order to solve a problem that representing 2 to 3% of the global CO2 emissions. So that means that will not happen in a very short time, that shipping will have access to this green energy. So green energy is going to be a scarce resource for many years. So that means that we cannot only think about that will be solved. So we need to think about how can we improve what we are doing today. How can we decarbonize our vision, our business today? How can we reduce emissions? How can we make our business as efficient as possible? And then I think that we have done a lot within our vessels, within the retrofitting and technical and operational side of our vessels. But I truly think that port efficiency and efficiency around the kind of that whole rotation could be improved. Then you can optimize the speed going into the port and also operate much more efficient in the port. I think that there's also shipping will now be measured next year on our carbon intensity. That will be open and transparent. And all ship owners need to really focus on how do we actually measure and report on our carbon intensity. So we have a strong incentive of actually doing that, make it as efficient as possible. But when we come into a port operation, as I mentioned, when we come into a major chemical hub or different terminals, we are kind of bound to the schedule that is possible from the port side, and that means that we will emit a lot of CO2 that's almost also our control, because we cannot control when we are coming to those different ports. And that extra emission, that is not measured anywhere. It's possible for us to kind of measure it, but that should be also connected to the efficiency of the port. So maybe it could be an alternative for the port also. The port reports on their direct emissions and also the supply chain emissions, but no one really report on the efficiency or the efficiency loss of an inefficient port operation. But then again, coming into my initial point, there are many different players in a port because there are many different terminals, there are refineries, there are different kind of players, bunkers, etc. in a port. So that problem has many different owners.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And actually, maybe I'll just turn quickly to you, Tiemen, just to maybe respond to that, because I thought that was quite interesting what Oisein spoke about in terms of how ports can better account for some of the inefficiencies. So do you have a sort of response to that from your perspective?
Yeah, you need, the devil's in the detail, because as I said, a port is an ecosystem with many players, and the terminals have their own incentives and own standards, et cetera, et cetera. But I think, the most important thing is actually transparency. And I'm saying that because if you're open about where you are, where you emit, how good or how bad are you in the various elements of your full scope 1, 2, and 3 system, and you share that transparency and what you want to do with the various stakeholders around you, initiatives start to happen. And I come back to this renewable energy dilemma. We went through an interesting process a few months ago and said, okay, in country X and in country Y, renewable energy, we're going to wait 5 to 8 to 10 years before there's something coming. We need to force the subject. And so we've surrounded ourselves, and there's no economic interest in this other than it needs to happen. But we shared our data, the most dirtiest ports in those and those locations, and what can be done. And you'll be surprised if you share that with people in the know, with people with the knowledge, how you can create it. Initiatives will start to launch. So for me, the transparency is very, very important. And equally, those who help you in your business around scope 3. We're demanding transparency from all our suppliers, from our 30 third-party transports. We're now demanding, and that's quite complex when you have CapEx, major expansion projects, imports in terminals around the world. And, how are your suppliers going to build that? With what methodologies and technologies, and what are their output going to be? But you need that transparency on the table, being able to influence it. And of course, upstream energy. So my key message here is it's very important to be non-defensive and highly transparent on what is going on in your operation.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really important point. And actually, there's been a lot of, unsurprisingly, a lot of talk about this at this COP. And actually, at the beginning of the week, the UN Secretary General and his expert group released a really important report on net zero reporting. And I think what's really key here, this is obviously just as relevant in shipping and other industries as well, is actually, while 30% of companies will have a net zero goal now, which is still pretty low when you think about what we need to do in the next few years, only 15% have published them. So you need to be transparent about what that transition plan actually looks like. And then, of course, even looking at those transition plans, a lot of them don't have interim targets and some of the things that we're speaking about here. What can we do today in terms of increasing efficiency at ports, and what do we need to be doing in the future? So collaboration, working obviously with renewable energy to make sure that supply is there in the future as well. So I'd now like to turn back to you, Soren. And please, from StormGeo, so please also, on the one hand, feel free to give any kind of reflection on what has been said so far, and also given what has been said so far, what do you think we need to do to really accelerate the work of green ports?
Yeah, I think it's, when you say accelerate, it's actually a good point, because, for example, we have a big oil company who for, I think, more than 10 years have actually been operating with a commercial model where the ship is slowed down on the way to the port. If we can see the port isn't able to accept the ship slows down. There's a saving on CO2, a saving on bunker, and that's shared between the stakeholders. This model has been out there for 10 years. So you can question why hasn't it been more widely adopted? It's a tool that is used. So I definitely think there are some things to accelerate here. And then I like a lot Tiemen's point about transparency. And I really like the example that Tiemen also gave about the port benefiting from the transparency coming from the ship, right? We're now here, we have this cargo mix, we're on the way, we're now delayed, or whatever it is, right? And I think that can be a win-win for both the ship and the port if we can make that feedback loop work. So I think some of the initiatives we've seen have a great commercial basis. Some is more focused on the technical side. I think by providing transparency, and that's through digital tools from the ship to the port and vice versa, we can start to unlock this value. As soon as people see that there's waste here and that there's an economic incentive, people will start changing their behavior. So I think there's something to build on here. Low-hanging fruits.
Yes, low-hanging fruit indeed. And also a communication challenge as well to make sure that they're aware of these solutions. I just want to ask you one question also, and it's coming back a little bit to what I mentioned in my introduction. That's obviously the importance of adaptation at ports. And obviously I was wondering if some of these digital tools that you're referencing and speaking about can also support ports when it comes to adapting to future climate risks and hazards and weather hazards. So is that something that these digital tools can also support?
Yes, well, not so much maybe digital tools, but definitely climatology. I think one thing that we are developing now, together with some very big companies, global players, is point climatology reports. That means if you're considering to build could be a data center or a port or whatever, a nuclear facility in some site, how is that site going to look in 20 years? That and 30 years due to climate change. And that sort of science should really be able to help a lot of industries to plan better. And of course, for ports, they are where they are today, right? But I'm sure when Tiemen and colleagues look about expansions or other changes to the port, this should go into the considerations, obviously. And here we are moving ahead in the weather industry to get better at that.
Yeah, no, really, really important. And I'm pleased that adaptation has been quite high on the agenda also when it comes to resilient port infrastructures, because obviously they really are on the front line of rising sea levels, both in terms of ports that might sink and then also whether the rising sea level will actually go in the opposite direction. So really important that's brought up. So we're coming sort of into the final round of questions for the panelists. And I might turn to you, Oisein, for this question, which is similar in terms of accelerating the work towards green ports, but I wonder what your view is on some of these green corridor projects that are also emerging, because I think what we're sort of touching upon a little bit throughout this discussion is that the tools and the channels are often there, but it's the collaboration, the communication that is missing. And obviously green corridors, for those that aren't aware, are public-private collaboration, sometimes private, sometimes public, but they involve a wide array of stakeholders from the port, ship owners, cargo owners, fuel producers, and we're seeing more and more. I think we have 19 now that have been announced from all over the world. So I'm wondering just quickly what your views are on those, and if you think those are the things that can really support the acceleration of green ports and also green shipping.
First of all, I do. Secondly, I think it's also important for everyone to understand what is a green corridor. Well, green corridor is an agreement or an ambition that you will do the sufficient investments on both sides in order to make sure that you can get a parity of a journey using a green fuel or an alternative fuel in order to sort of equal out the differences in price from a fossil fuel to a new fuel, and that you make sure that you do the correct investments. Because as a ship owner, we will not be able to pay more for a greener fuel if we can run on a cheaper legal fuel that is allowed to do that we can use. So that means that for us it's important that that the future fuel or a green fuel and green operations is at the same cost as the alternative. So in order to do that, the different ports have set up these ambitions to have that they agree on both sides, and also with the ship that's going to go that route, that they will do the sufficient investment. And how to get that investment? Well, I think that investment needs to come from a market-based measure. That means that someone needs to pay for the pollution, and someone needs to pay for the CO2 emissions, and that will happen. We will see that happen from the EU emission trading scheme. But I think that this kind of revenues from this ETS, it has to go back to the industry. It has to go back to contractor difference. It has to go back to the green ports in order to incentivize and finance these green ports. So I think that circular way of thinking, that the industry will be able to solve this problem if we are able to use that revenue or that tax. So now you're hearing a ship owner calling for taxes, because we're very positive to market-based measures, because we think that can really drive the transition. I am skeptical that the revenues into the ETS will just go into feeding into the EU economy or any other ETS that will go just to feed into another economy. That will only increase the cost. I think that revenue needs to come back to the industry, and that can drive projects, incentives, and finance the contract of difference in order to make a green corridor successful.
Thank you. So it sounds like from what you're saying that it will more be regulation and market-based measures that will drive the changes needed. And of course you reference ETS, but there's a equally, if not more important discussion going to be happening at the International Maritime Organization in July with the MEPC 80, where IMO member states are going to be renegotiating the greenhouse gas strategy. And there's a lot of call here at the COP. And shipping really is in the spotlight to increase its ambition, and we're hopeful that this will happen. So I'm very conscious of time, so I'd just like to turn very quickly to Tiemen for some final reflections. And actually, in particular, we're in Egypt now, but next year we'll be in the UAE for COP28. So what kind of acceleration and what kind of collaboration do you think will be needed towards green ports, and how can the COP28 presidency leverage on that?
Yeah,
big question for 1 minute.
Kind of a big question on a huge topic, right? I think I need to add to what Odfjell said. This is important, this level playing field around the cost. And it may be an underestimated point for politicians. But the beauty is, if you can reach it, I would argue that the markets will take care of the rest, if you follow me, because you will see, rather than, a fake green corridor marketing versus a real green corridor marketing will attract the business in these green corridors, and it will therefore become self-propelled. I hope I'm clear, but this is actually a key message to regulators and lawmakers, I would say. Otherwise, the only thing I can add is I come back to my words around transparency. We're learning on the go. I always say, at least in our ports business, we do other businesses in transportation. In our ports business, we found answers for 50, 60% of the troubles. So there's still a 40% left. The 60%, by the way, still need to be executed. So there's a ton of work in terms of ahead, but this transparency up and down your own value chain on what your challenges are, and bringing the partners around the table and workshop them through. For me, this is key to get the remaining part done.
Thank you. And with that, I'd like to wholeheartedly thank our panelists for joining us. I know we're out of time. So maybe just a few wrap-up points. So transparency has obviously emerged as a really a key topic, and that's not just in this conversation, that's throughout the COP27. So transparency, publishing your transition plans, and not being afraid to do so, because we're all learning, and we all need to learn from each other at this stage, because we're all stabbing a little bit in the dark. Efficiency, the tools are there, but once again, it's collaboration and communication around these tools to implement them. Regulation is important, and I agree with Oisein. The shipping industry really is calling for taxation. That doesn't always happen, so let's ensure that the regulators are hearing that, particularly with a view to this summer at the International Maritime Organization. And then once again, another key theme throughout this COP, and I think I touched upon this, tools and channels are there. It's people, it's collaboration that are going to unlock these. So let's keep on talking, and thank you very much for joining us here this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.